Further exploration into the Piri Reis map. A patron asks, "Hi Dr Kos. The Adam and Eve story video referenced some listed items 16, 17, discussing the Egyptian water clock showing agreement with the Piri Reis map, and that the North Pole was in Egypt. Could you please research to see if there is anything supporting that assertion? Thank you." Okay, so check out my conference in July. It'll be great, preparing a big presentation for that, talking about lost stone circles. And back to the video. So let's answer those questions. So in the previous video, we looked into an obscure character called Chan Thomas, who wrote several books. I have covered some of his controversial theories regarding Adam and Eve in the previous video. And Chan provided his own theory, which he added to Charles Hapgood's Earth's shifting crust theory. And Chan said there were two biblical catastrophes, one in 9,500 BC and one in 5,500 BC. And the more I look into Chan Thomas' theory, the more I like it, the more I see it is basically Hapgood's theory, because Hapgood also talked about the 9,500 BC. But what Chan did was say that's the time of Genesis, and the later one, 5,500 BC, the time of Noah. And so many polar tilt authors have been inspired by Hapgood, and I think the polar tilt idea is kind of brilliant. Chan suggests a polar tilt mechanism as the only thing that could match all of his specified criteria, all of these anomalies which pop up in the fossil record, which pop up in the archaeological record. Now, his anomalies, his criteria that he used to make his theory are quite interesting, and he tries to answer all of them in his theory. So some of them are highly scientific, some are taken from now questionable literature. And Chan sought to explain everything by his theory. So let me give you an example. Criteria number 1. This is what Chan wrote in his book. The berry soft mammoth with buttercups frozen in his mouth. 2. The age of Niagara and St. Anthony's Falls, both about 7,000 years. 3. The sudden end of the Laurentian Basin ice cap in Canada about 11,500 years ago. 4. The uninterrupted evolution on the Galapagos over 11,000 years. 5. Murrumbidgee River Basin system in Australia showing the end of an ice cap there about 11,500 years ago. 6. The age of fossil bones taken from the Wiltshire Boulevard tar pits, which age over 11,000 years. 7. The sudden end of all work on the prehistoric city of Tiwanaku, 11,500 years ago. It goes on and on. But all the catastrophes he describes are about 11,500 or 7,000 years ago. Hence, as he says, two catastrophes, the catastrophe in Genesis and the catastrophe of Noah's flood. Now, let's fast forward to item number 16, because that's what the patron asks about. The Piri Reis map showing the North Pole in Egypt, and 17, the Egyptian water clock showing agreement with the Piri Reis map. So let's get into both of those, because the patron didn't know what Thomas Chan was on about, Chan Thomas was on about, and in fact, Chan doesn't make it clear in his book. He's taken the info from elsewhere, probably mainly Hapgood. The thing is, this stuff isn't really in Hapgood's book either, but I think I know what Chan is actually on about, and he didn't make it very clear. So for number 16, that the Piri Reis map shows the North Pole in Egypt. Okay, regarding this, I think that, to my knowledge, Hapgood never suggested that Egypt was once the North Pole. Rather, he suggested the pole was somewhere in Canada, and that it had shifted several times over the last 10,000 years. In Chan's book, also, he never suggests the North Pole was ever in Egypt. He states, and I quote, and you can read the full book at archive.org. I found it there, the 1993 version, and it's brilliant. He says on page 28, 11,500 years ago, in 9,550 BC, as dated by astronomers from Potsdam Observatory, from writings in the ruins of Tiwanaku, the 60-mile thick shell of the earth shifted its position once more in quarter to half a day, about 7,000 years after the previous shift. And I'll just interrupt to say I think he might be quoting Bellamy. We covered Bellamy, who wrote a book on Tiwanaku, one of the students of Poznański. Okay, back to the quote from Chan. The North Pole moved southward, and the Sudan Basin in Africa shifted to the North Pole. This was the time, as the Talmud writes, when the setting of the Pleiades below the horizon occurred, and the Holy Land was moved into a region of terrible cold for many generations, actually for about 4,500 to 5,000 years, until Noah's flood about 7,000 years ago. So the cataclysm of 11,500 years ago saw the Hudson Bay and the opposite area just southwest of Australia both roll to the equator on opposite sides of the Earth, and the Sudan Basin roll to the North Pole to remain there for the next 4,500 to 5,000 years. While this shift was occurring, taking only a quarter to half a day to complete itself, the Earth's oceans and atmosphere, through angular momentum, kept rotating in their normal direction during most of the shift, with oceans violently inundating most of the lands of the Earth at supersonic speeds, and the atmosphere bringing unimaginable hurricanes of supersonic wind velocities. Whole countries were subjected to immense upheavals and earthquakes. Huge mountain ranges were created. The 60-mile thick molten layer below the 60-mile thick shell of the Earth broke through the shell in places all over the world and was thereafter called Earth Fire by the pitiful few who survived. So that's what he's saying. Chan never says that Egypt was the North Pole. So what's going on? Okay, so I find myself increasingly impressed with this work because when I look at the Ice Age temperatures, no one can see why they violently swing backwards and forth like a clock and like a ticking clock, and there is no known mechanism for this, for what can be responsible for such a wild oscillation of 5 degrees a decade. So do the ocean currents keep changing? What's going on? Does the sun start flickering? Or does the Earth's crust slip around, only finding stability, say in the last 10,000 years, which has allowed a massive population growth, but possibly a lower IQ population to the humans who lived earlier on? And I do not agree with the Milankovitch cycles as explaining a slight polar tilt, sunlight being reflected off the ice caps, the albedo, because Fred Hoyle, who was enormously ahead of his time, one of my major heroes, having read all his sci-fi and his real books, he said that this does not change the net heat reaching Earth. He was unimpressed with the albedo explanation in his Ice Age book. So is this Earth tilt an explanation for that? Okay, now back to the question. It's clear that what is being referred to is the polar projection. Egypt as the North Pole of the Piri Reis map. Now, okay, that's in question as well, because actually the map does seem centered in Egypt, and which is very weird for a Turkish admiral to have done. But I don't think it's a polar projection either. But this idea led people such as von Däniken to famously write that the Piri Reis map is like looking at Earth from space, and from being some distance above Egypt. But actually, what we're looking at is not a polar coordinate possibly, but circular portlands around Egypt in terms of a 12-inch compass system. And this is an obscure medieval grid system based on the 12 wind system, or possibly, I would theorize, you would overlay some medieval metal instrument on top of the map. That's what I'm guessing, to make sense of them, and because by themselves they don't seem to be much use. And the name seems based on Porto line or lane, or lane to the port, distance to the port, but we don't actually know how to use them, which I find quite fascinating. Modern sailors, I don't think, don't know how to use this system, and I don't think anyone knows how to use this system. So for that reason, I don't think it's a polar projection at all, which is a modern idea, and it's something completely different where you skew all the countries around the edges. I think that was done merely to fit the countries onto the edge of the velum, the parchment. But Hapgood theorized it was a polar coordinate system in his book. Okay, so that's the first part out of the way. That's point number 16. Let's get on to point number 17. So let's look into this next question, making sense of the weird and wacky statement, even more curious than the previous one, which is the Egyptian water clock showing agreement with the Piri Reis map. So that's one of Chan Thomas's criteria. Okay, what the hell is Chan on about? Now, I couldn't find anything about water clocks in Hapgood's 1958 book on Earth's shifting crust. The only way a water clock would be used to generate the Piri Reis map might be for measuring longitude, the time between astronomical phenomena at two different places on Earth. But that can't be, because the Egyptians really didn't travel by sea, but maybe the pre-Egyptians did. So I think Chan is actually referring to a well in Syene, and he calls that the water clock, because this is the place that Hapgood alleges is at the centre of the map. It's also the place where Eratosthenes calculated the size of the Earth. Let me explain. This place, holding a once famous well, was called Syene, also called Suen before that, and is now called Asuen or Aswan, and it is located on the Tropic of Canker. This means nothing to anyone until I explain what the tropics are and therefore why that well is significant. The word tropic has an interesting history. Naturally, the tropics are at points about 23 and a bit degrees north and south of the equator, taken as a fraction of 90 degrees. This conveniently places them about a quarter of the way north and south of the equator. This region is known as the tropics since probably ancient times. The word tropo, having gone tropo, it means to turn. It's related to trephine. So the tropics turn faster than the rest of the planet. I think that might be where the name comes from. So how are the tropics calculated? The Tropic of Canker is actually the southernmost place where the sun is directly overhead for at least one day of the year, that's the solstice, in summer, for a moment of time. This just doesn't happen north or south of the tropics. The sun is never directly overhead. In those regions, the sun rather rises and sets on a shallow angle, so that sunsets can seem to last forever in polar regions. But in the tropics, the sunset and sunrise are very short indeed, with the sun coming directly up or down. So in the tropics, there are many days with the sun directly overhead. Now this well, which was in Syene, had one day a year where the sun never touched the sides, but merely illuminated the water inside, and therefore it was quite a curiosity for people in ancient times to have a look. Now, probably a similar mechanism was driving the wells in Sardinia. I imagine it's much the same thing, since they're so Egyptian-like, and I imagine the lost well in Syene probably looked like the ones in Sardinia. Now, Eratosthenes knew about this well, he took the information, and he used it to calculate the size of the planet. He measured the 7-degree difference in the shadow between Alexandria and Syene on the summer solstice, and hired someone, or read in a book, the distance between Syene and Alexandria, which was conveniently 5,000 stadia, which he took as about a 7-degree slice of the spherical Earth, arriving eventually at 40,000 kilometres for the circumference. Now, Columbus actually didn't have access to this measurement. He used other measurements. Eratosthenes' measure of a larger Earth having eluded him. Now, I think that must be the water clock described by Chan, and it's a pity that Chan doesn't allow his reader to always know what he's talking about. But anyway, now Chan's book is excellent, but Hapgood's book is better. Now, Hapgood, in his book, he doesn't ever seem to claim anything absolutely. He often supplies multiple solutions. The thing is, Egypt is a perfect place for the centre of the Piri Reis map, because not only does it agree with Syene, as stated by Hapgood, but it agrees with the Great Pyramid, because you see, the people who built the Great Pyramid must have had this world map, because they incorporated basically the same dimensions into the Great Pyramid as those supposedly come up with by Mr. Eratosthenes. So the conclusion is that between the Bronze Age catastrophe and the Trojan War, the knowledge just after the Trojan War, in the Bronze Age catastrophe, the knowledge of worldwide travel was lost until about the time of Columbus. That's 2,500 years of not knowing what was on the other side of the planet. We see in the pyramid and in the famous Syene Well that this region was Egypt, or one of Egypt's Greenwiches. It was the Tropic of Canker inside Egypt. And it wasn't called Egypt after the Copts or Gipts at the time, maybe, but KMT, after possibly the Cimmerians, as I've suggested in a previous video, one of the names of the pre-Egyptians. And to finish off, I'm going to give you Hapgood's own words on this subject. It's very good reading from his page 17 of maps of the ancient sea kings. Here we go. The search for the centre of the map lasted about 3 years. We thought from the beginning that the lines extending from the 5 projection points probably met in Egypt. We used various methods to project the lines to the point where they would meet. Our first guess for the centre of the map was the city of Alexandria. This appealed to me because Alexandria was long the centre of science and learning of the ancient world. It seemed likely that if they were drawing a world map, the Alexandrian geographers might naturally make their own city its centre. However, this guess proved to be wrong. A contradiction appeared. The big wind rose in the North Atlantic, looked as if it were meant to lie on the Tropic of Cancer. One of the lines from this centre evidently was directed towards the centre of the map. But we noticed that this line was at right angles to our prime meridian. This meant, of course, that it was a parallel of latitude. Now, the Tropic of Cancer is at 23.5 north latitude, and therefore the parallel from the wind rose would reach a centre in Egypt about 23.5 degrees north. But Alexandria is not in that latitude at all. It lies in 31 degrees north, therefore Alexandria could not be the centre of our circle. We looked at the map of ancient Egypt to find, if we could, a suitable city on the Tropic of Cancer that might serve as the centre of the map. We were still attached to the idea the centre of the map should be some important place such as a city. Later, we were emancipated from this erroneous notion. Looking along the Tropic of Cancer, we found the ancient city of Syene lying just north of the tropic near the present city of Assuan, where the Great Dam was built. Now we recalled the scientific feat of Eratosthenes, the Greek astronomer and geographer of the 3rd century BC, who measured the circumference of the Earth by taking account of the angle of the sun at noon and simultaneously observed at Alexandria and Syene. We were happy to change our working theory and adopt Syene as the centre of the map. With the help of hindsight, we could now see how reasonable it was to place the centre of the map on the tropic. An astronomically determined line on the centre of the Earth, the poles, the tropics, and the equator can be exactly determined by celestial observations, and they have all been the basis of map making in all times. Syene too was an important city suitable for the centre. Thank you.